Sound check. There we are. Hello. And good afternoon. I'm Bruce Lamott, conductor of the Philharmonia Chorale. And it's my great pleasure to invite you to come and hear this magnificent performance, and it will be, I guarantee it, of Judas Maccabeus, which is being heard here for the first time since 1992. Those of you with a long history with Philharmonia may realize that we haven't performed any, in the 35 years Nick McGeegan has been music director, we have never repeated an oratorio. There are 21 English oratorios of Handel, except for this one, and Messiah. So it is indeed a very special occasion for us. This is the first time that we're performing it with the chorale. It is recorded with the UC Chamber Chorus, as I say, from 1992, 24 years ago. Now, most of us of the Goyim have no idea who Judas Maccabeus was, other than maybe what we learned in grade school about the Feast of Lights and Hanukkah, because it resides in that sort of neither fish nor fowl area in the Bible between the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and the New Testament. And Christian denominations have differed variously on how much to regard these books, including 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The Roman Catholic faith, because St. Jerome included it in his Bible, have adopted it as a part of the Bible, as have the Greek Orthodox. Handel's Anglicans believed that it was good for documentation, but not for doctrine. So it's a nice thing to read, but don't believe it too heavily. And then if you're a Presbyterian in recovery, like I am, it actually didn't even exist in our Bibles. The Apocrypha, you have to go looking for someone else's Bible to find those wonderful stories. But I want to talk just a little bit about Handel's interesting preoccupation with the children of Israel and the Israelites, because 14 of his 21 English oratorios are based on Jewish subjects. Esther, Deborah, Athaliah, Saul, Israel in Egypt, Samson, Joseph and his brethren, Belshazzar, Judas Maccabeus at number 9, Joshua, Alexander Balus, Susanna, Solomon, and Jephthah. Now, for some time, there was a common misunderstanding that Handel was appealing to a Jewish audience. Well, that might work for the San Francisco Symphony, but it did not work in 18th century London. First of all, because the population there was marginalized. Yes, there were some wealthy Jews in London, but the Jewish population of London could not afford subscriptions, even to buy tickets to Judas Maccabeus, which is the first time that Handel opened up his box office, as it were, to non-subscribers. Up till then, he had had an aristocratic patronage who had bought subscriptions. Now you could walk up, buy a ticket, and enjoy the show. And this also marks a sort of change then in the nature of his oratorios, because they become somewhat more populist and current and a little less sophisticated, perhaps, than those that were written by Charles Jennens. The Old Testament, of course, provided Handel with great stories and material, because these oratorios, after all, were born during Lent, when Handel had an opera company on his hand, a theater, but a prohibition by the Archbishop of London not to perform opera. So what do? You perform operas about God, and you don't stage them, and that was the crux. You use chorus of choristers from St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey. He could use singers that he had already previously recycled from his operas, and he could continue to make money, and with Judas Maccabeus, he made a pile. The Christians, both then and now, have always regarded the ancient Israelites as kind of proto-Christian believers, what the Handel scholar Ruth Smith calls British Israel. And this is represented in the Book of Common Prayer, for instance, in 1662, where we read, "O Lord, save the King, and mercifully hear us when we call upon thee. Endue thy ministers with righteousness, and make thy chosen people joyful." Now, by the time we get to the mid-18th century, there had been great questions about the Mosaic religion, as Judaism was sometimes called. And people like Charles Jennens had libraries with a number of theologians who talked about this particular concept. One of those books, which was circulating by a theologian named William Warburton, says this: "Had the Mosaic religion been absolutely good, that is, good for all men as well as for the Jews, it had certainly never been abolished. It was relatively good, say, as it fully answered the design of God who gave it, which was to preserve a chosen people, and to prepare the way for further revelation of a religion absolutely good, or a religion for the use of all mankind, i.e. Christianity." But I get ahead of myself. Let's talk a little bit about this story. Alexander the Great's empire had been divided after his death into a number of portions, one large swath of which extended from India all the way to the Dardanelles and included Jerusalem. It was known as the Seleucid Empire, and it was known for its Hellenistic qualities. That is, they adopted the art and culture and religion of Greece. And the emperor of this Seleucid Empire, when our story opens, is one Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Epiphanes, I hope there's not a Greek scholar here, who was ruling this vast empire. And he had a particular antipathy to the Jews that were living in Judea around Jerusalem. So he abolished the Sabbath. He abolished circumcision, and he put Greek idols in Herod's temple in Jerusalem and had pigs sacrificed on the altars of the temple. Every possible way of profaning this sacred site to the Jews. In addition, just to rub it in a little bit further, into the provinces, he sent emissaries, and there was one that went to a little town called Medellin, which was not far from Jerusalem. And this emissary built an altar in the middle of the city, and he brought in a priest who began to do some of these pagan sacrifices, and a man named Mattathias came out with a sword and slew both the priest and the emissary. That was Judas Maccabeus' father, Mattathias, who then becomes the first instigator of a rebellion against the Seleucid Empire. He literally heads for the hills and takes people with him, and he begins a rebellion that his son will take up midway through part 1 of our oratorio. Mattathias dies presumably a natural death at the ripe old age of 146. And when we begin the oratorio, the chorus is in mourning for his death and mourning the fact that they have lost their leader. They have, it's quite a beautiful chorus, as we'll hear a little bit of it in a moment. His eldest son, Judas Maccabeus, picks up his father's mantle, goes into battle against 2 of these enemies, wins a couple of battles, and then, worst of all, he hears that Antiochus and his cronies are on the march. And this time they are leading a new offensive armed with the exotic element of elephants, tower-backed elephants with little towers on the top, which they presumably, according to the scripture, had made a little bit tipsy on berries and grapes to make them a little more courageous, I guess. This creates a little period of angst at the end of part 1. And then when we get to part 2, we will see that Judas becomes triumphant. In Act 3, we'll get back to Act 2 in a moment, Simon, Judas's brother, who becomes the high priest of the temple, having recaptured Jerusalem, rededicates the temple, purifies it of its porcine past, gets rid of those statues, and celebrates what is called the Feast of Lights. That rededication comes the word Hanukkah, which means dedication. Don't be looking for oil and miracles, however, because that story is in 2nd Maccabees, not the book that Thomas Morell set here in the oratorio. Nonetheless, the 3rd act is about Hanukkah, so we're not guilty of advertising that is not accurate. There is a couple of odd qualities about this, or unusual qualities. One is a kind of generic characterization. Other than Judas and his brother Simon and a couple of emissaries, the bulk of the story is being told through a sort of archetypical Israelitish man and Israelitish woman. The title heroic tenor role was sung by James Baird, who was Handel's go-to tenor. He was about 30. He had already been in 10 of Handel's operas, and Baird sang the tenor part in every one of Handel's English oratorios, save one. He also scandalized London when he married one Lady Henrietta Herbert, because it was the first marriage of a noble lady to an actor. These two archetypical roles, surprisingly, are both sung by women. The Israelitish woman was 17-year-old Elisabetta Gambarini, who is described as an organist, harpsichordist, conductor, and painter, and she publishes the first keyboard music in Britain ever composed by a woman, Elisabetta Gambarini. The Israelitish man in her 20s was Katarina Gali, his kind of all-purpose mezzo, and she sang everything else. It didn't matter, messenger, Israelitish man, or whatever. But her specialty was trouser rolls, and when you hear what he wrote for her, she clearly had a capacious range. She had flexibility, far larger range than a castrato in the mezzo-soprano range would have had. And for her, Handel later wrote the leading roles in Solomon and Alexander Bolos. So we, the chorus, this time around, only get to play the children of Israel. I say only because we really like those oratorios where we get a chance to play Babylonians or some other heathen, pagan, kind of orgiastic culture to contrast with our piety as Israelites. But, as I say, you sing what you're given. And the first time that we meet the chorus, they are mourning their dead father, Mattathias, with a kind of dead march, and the text, "Your hero, your father, your friend is no more." The librettist, Reverend Thomas Morell, Doctor of Divinity, was a vicar in the Anglican Church, as well as a philologist of ancient languages. And he writes rather churchly lyrics at times. We'll have a little more to talk about him later, but you'll notice some very kind of familiar strains and the important role of religion in this particular piece. Simon mentions in his aria, "In defense of your nation, religion, and laws." And then the chorus later on says, "We will follow thee to conquest, if to fall for laws, religion, liberty, we fall." So there is a kind of religious overtone to all of this. And the nature of the music that Handel writes at times sounds almost like an Anglican parish church choir. For instance, the opening of this particular chorus, which could easily find itself into a hymn book. This piece was composed against the backdrop of a very serious time in English history, the Jacobite Rising of 1745, which had been brutally quashed by Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, who was the third son of George II, at the Battle of Culloden in April of 1746. The analogy is not coincidental, it's very explicit. The dedication of the piece says, "To His Royal Highness Prince William, Duke of Cumberland, this faint portraiture of a truly wise, valiant, and virtuous commander, as to the possessor of the like noble qualities." Will Scots would have a bit to say about that, because he was also known as the Butcher of Culloden, who instructed his troops at the end of the battle simply to massacre any of the injured on the battlefield. But it's even possible that Act 1, if you read the text quite carefully, nothing is concluded by the end of Act 1. That means you must come back after intermission. But what it means more importantly is that there was still the possibility, at least, that we might fail. And it's possible that Morel and Handel were actually working on this in 1745, early 1746, when the outcome of the Jacobite uprising was not even known. We'll come back to some of those parallels, but what was happening all around them was that Bonnie Prince Charlie was leading a troop of Scottish Catholics, Irish, Tories who didn't believe that the Catholics should ever have been dethroned in the first place, and they were marching south on London with the fear in London that the French were going to arrive from the south with reinforcements. And so there was a great deal of anxiety and fear in London at the time. We can see this kind of change in the attitude in one little trick of orchestration. I think it's really quite interesting. In the first aria, we have the first aria of kind of bellicose sentiment. We have Simon singing "Arm, Arm Ye Brave," and with characteristic fanfares being played in the orchestra. Except these are kind of substitute trumpets. These are fanfares which are being played by oboes and violins.
Arm, ye brave, a noble cause, a noble
He saves the real fanfares for 2/3 of the way through part 2, when Judas Maccabeus is leading his troops or exhorting his troops to battle. And Handel, the dramatist, lies in wait for us because he presents us with a common garden variety da capo aria that he wrote hundreds of in the opera, in which we hear an A section being sung by the tenor with the measly, if you will, continuo accompaniment of organ and bass and cello. He sings the first sentence, he sings the second sentence, and then at the point where it normally says da capo, just take it from the top, Handel completely reorchestrates it, brings in 3 trumpets, timpani, and the oboes, and really gives us a martial fanfare here. You can look forward to that in part 2. Don't leave after that, because the flutes and the French horns are going to come in part 3, for sure. So at first, this analogy to the Duke of Cumberland seems a little garbled, because with Judas Maccabeus, a godly guerrilla rebels are overthrowing the heathen forces of a Greek heathen empire, whereas with the Jacobites, it's the imperial forces of the Protestant Hanoverians in Great Britain who are suppressing Catholics and those Anglican Tories in order to reinstate a Catholic monarch who at the moment is living in Catholic France, all of course subject to the Pope in Rome. Now we see a few glimpses of this Protestantism showing through on page 56, if you happen to have your program present. In a brief recitative, you will hear the Israelitish woman refer to Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth is the same as Ishtar, that is the great goddess of the Near East, the heathen goddess, except that he calls her the Queen of Heaven. Well, this was one of the sticking points, of course, with Protestants and Catholics about the role of Mary. And if you keep reading, hence to Phoenicia be the goddess driven, or be she with her priests and pageants, they also didn't like the vestments and the pageantry of the Mass, hurled to the remotest corner of the world, Rome, ne'er to delude us with more pious ties. It lies there right under the surface. Here is that recitative.
To Phoenicia be the goddess driven, or be she with her priests and pageants hurled to the remotest corner of the world, ne'er to delude us more with pious lies.
Another issue, of course, between Catholics and Protestants is the role of statuary. And consequently, we have a magnificent chorus following a duet to this impossible-to-sing text. We never will bow down to the rude stock or sculptured stone. Please try saying rude stock or sculptured stone about 45 times. See where it leaves you. And after throwing away this idea of these graven images, the choir launches into, I think, Handel feeling his Lutheran roots, what sounds very much like a Bach chorale, even worked out as Bach would do it, with counterpoint in a kind of double fugue. So Bach would have been very proud to have heard that, I'm sure. While we're stopped with the sculptured stone and the rude stock, I might mention that if you really want to be kind to yourself, do not try to read the libretto out loud. Let Handel's music overcome the deficiencies in the text. This is a writer who is preoccupied with alliteration. There are some turns of phrase that you won't believe. There is no love interest here. You might think that there might be, because the soprano sings, "For thee we pant and sigh for thee, with whom eternal pleasures reign. Come, ever-smiling liberty." We have another line such as, "Judah disdains the galling load of hostile chains." That is, once again, a real problem for us. But there are a couple of just kind of smiley moments that I want you to enjoy along with the rest of us. We know that one of the reasons I think that Handel liked Morel was that he did not criticize him. And it's very strange that Morel did not inform him that in the English language there are two different meanings for the word vain. There is vanity, as in "you're so vain you probably think the song is about you," and then there is vanity meaning futility. And so Handel barges right ahead, writing one of the greatest braggadocio operas in the whole tenor repertoire, to this text. "How vain is man," I think he got that far. "How vain is man who boasts in fight the valor of gigantic might." And the whole rest of it is talking about the vanity of valor, not an expression of human vanity. It's kind of a nice moment. So after Messiah, Judas Maccabeus became Handel's most popular oratorio in the 18th and 19th centuries. There were 54 performances in Handel's lifetime, 33 of which he conducted. And the best known tune in the piece wasn't written for this piece at all. It was written for Joshua and became known as, from Judas Maccabeus, "See the Conquering Hero Comes." Many of you probably played this in high school band, or perhaps from the Suzuki books. It was used for the dedication of railway stations in Britain in the 19th century. And the connection was sort of cemented when Beethoven wrote 12 variations on "See the Conquering Hero" from Judas Maccabeus for cello and piano. So as we are about to embark on a Beethoven year, the 250th anniversary of his birth, I thought it appropriate here to close with that chorus and then just one of those 12 variations from Beethoven. Here's the chorus.
See the conquering hero comes, sound the trumpets, beat the drums. Swords prepare, the laurel bring, songs of triumph to him sing. Swords prepare, the laurel bring, songs of triumph to him sing.
There are 11 more where that came from. There are also a lot more wonderful tunes in this show that Beethoven didn't get a hold of, and we hope you will enjoy all of them in our performance this afternoon. Thanks very much for coming.